Thank you for the kind introduction, and wow, that was an impressive presentation of Scott. Thank you for being here. Impressive. I'd like to talk to you eventually. Really. So what I'm trying to talk about, essentially I just picked the title of Ryan, Becoming Sufficiently Decentralized, and came up with my own slide deck. Wasn't so easy. First slide's already like a definition. Becoming sufficiently decentralized. I would like to quote each of these words individually because we don't even know what decentralization really is. If you go into the internet and take a look at what people think about decentralized blockchains, decentralized applications, decentralized this, that, you will quickly find out that there's no common understanding of what really decentralized means. What aspect is decentralized? How is it decentralized? There's no description. There's no hard evidence. No real metric. What I mean with there's no real metric, Scott mentioned it earlier. We can't compare a degree of decentralization. Is this blockchain decentralized by a degree 1, 2, 3, 45, or is it maybe decentralized 0%, 96%, 42%? Or some other random metric. We don't know. We really don't have any way of comparing two blockchains with respect to its decentralization. We don't even know what decentralization or decentralized really means in a broad way. So I don't have an answer to that. So if you expect that, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to it. But I have a couple of properties that you can look at when it comes to decentralization. So there's a couple of typical properties, characteristics of a blockchain technology, a deployed blockchain like Bitcoin, that you can look at. And one of is, well, if you go look through Satoshi's white paper, you can see a couple of graphs, and there's like graph theory with stars and meshed networks and these kind of things. He describes it like there's no central point of failure for decentralization. I would say this is a critical point of being decentralized. There's no single point of failure. Whatever that exactly means, because there's many aspects that could fail in many different ways. The more interesting part is something that Scott meant with who controls the blockchain. I say block production, because essentially that's who controls what kind of data comes into the blockchain. It's a block production. One block, 10 minutes later, 3 seconds later, whatever, a new block comes in. The people that create this block are the ones that control what's getting into the blockchain. So who controls block production? And in quotes it says here, the number of entities to reach 51%. Why is this important? Because there needs to be found consensus about what's actually entering the blockchain. In Bitcoin, we all know there's this proof of work. It's a consensus scheme, and it says how all of these miners come to the agreement of which block's actually going to go into the blockchain. And everyone that knows about consensus knows that 51%, actually 50% plus an infinite fraction, define what the consensus of a group is. So the number of entities that you need to convince to do something to reach 51% of that, for instance, hashing power, that's like a metric that you can use to figure out how decentralized it is. This is actually a metric we can number. It goes by 1, 2, 3, 4. There's one entity, two entities, 4 entities that you need to convince when it comes to adding a new block to the blockchain. Something else that I would consider important for decentralization is the barrier of entry into block production. Proof of work, all you need is some money, buy some miners, get into that business. Is this a high barrier? Is it a low barrier? That's something I cannot decide, but it's a property for decentralization. Geographic separation is, well, local separation, like a decentralization when you think of globe, like the Earth. If all the blockchain content is just stored in Europe, you couldn't call it decentralized, right? And if it's in Europe and the US, you couldn't call it decentralized either, because it wouldn't really be, there would be a central point of failure. because there's a connection going underseas between Europe and the US. If that breaks, you just break the entire network into two parts. So that's not decentralized. This is where the entire peer-to-peer, peer-peer-ish idea comes into. So I call these kind of the hard facts of the typical properties of decentralization. There's a couple untypical properties. Well, a lot of people argue about those, let's say it that way. One, for instance, is the geographic distribution of full nodes. Full nodes don't really do anything other than validate what the block producers do. Do we need them for the blockchain? Technically, no. Do we need them to increase our trust into what's going on? Yes, absolutely. Do we need them to be distributed on the globe? Not necessarily. Is it convenient if they are distributed globally? Absolutely. So this is something you can argue hours and hours and hours. Then there's jurisdictional cover. Consider all the miners are in China. China decides to switch them all off at once. That's a central point of failure, right? But there's something in between having everything in one country and having them all across all countries on the globe, because there's a ton of countries, right? There's something that's, we call this protocol upgrades. It's untypical because a lot of blockchains don't even think about protocol upgrades. A protocol upgrade is usually called a hard fork. That term doesn't work anymore. It's now something else, hard forks. Essentially, it just introduces a change to how the protocol works. That happens very, very, very rarely with Bitcoin, happens much more frequently with other blockchains. But it's a question how decentralized this is. Who decides that the protocol is changed? And how is it changed? And how do you proceed with changing it? Then some blockchains have some sort of governance that builds on top of just picking the block producer. We need to think about decentralization there as well. We heard about who's paying the rewards, funding, not just paying the block producers, but also paying further development. That's a question you need to answer as well when it comes to decentralization. Then there's something that's legally called a common enterprise. In the space right now, there's a lot of blockchains that have a support of a common enterprise. Think of a foundation that's working specifically to improve and advertise and whatever this particular blockchain. Can't really be a decentralized system if there's one foundation that has the funding and does things for this particular blockchain, right? Can it? Can it not? I don't know. It's a question that needs to be answered. The existence, well, the number of different protocol implementations, that's a technical detail. Let's not waste time on this. And the availability of different user interfaces as well. It's convenient to not have to download this particular thing to be able to interact with Bitcoin. And we are there on Bitcoin already. But is it really a property of being decentralized? It's a property of being convenient to use this for a user. So these are, if you want to have a long discussion with people in the Bitcoin space, pick one of these. Yeah? If you want to have an even longer discussion with someone from the Bitcoin space, the blockchain space, pick one of these. I personally think these are almost certainly not properties of decentralization. For instance, the use of a particular consensus scheme. Proof of work, proof of stake, proof of, you name it. They all come with a specific advantage and disadvantages. The engineer picks one, the system prefers one, whatever, but it really has nothing to do with decentralization. That's an opinion, of course. The existence of a blockchain also doesn't mean that it's decentralized, right? We can run a blockchain on one node that's centralized because if that one node breaks, it's gone. Like, that cannot be a definition for being decentralized, that it's a blockchain. To some extent, it needs to be a distributed blockchain that runs on many different servers, and then you get redundancy. That's also not necessarily required, but just because you're redundant doesn't mean it's decentralized. Being public, being private, that's a discussion I think everyone has heard already. Being transparent is also something that doesn't make it decentralized. If you think about it, just because it's transparent could mean anything. A particular token or its supply has nothing to do with it being, from a technical point of view, being decentralized. The existence of scripting or contracting on the blockchain is also just a technical detail, essentially. It has nothing to do with decentralization at all. People always say, there's a peer-to-peer network, it has to be decentralized. No, it means it's distributed across a mesh network. That's what it says. Peer-to-peer network is just talking to people in a mesh network, nothing more. And then there's something people rarely talk about when it comes to blockchain space, that's liabilities. That's something we can argue about whether it's decentralized or not, but I've never seen an application for a decentralized liability. If any one of you has, please talk to me. I'm really curious to figure out what this is. Also cryptography. This is blurred a little because there's one primitive in cryptography that's really required for a blockchain-ish thing, which is hashing. But everything else is not required for being decentralized, really. So now the question is becoming sufficiently decentralized. The question is, what do we actually need to decentralize? What's the aspect? And there's a couple of aspects. I'd say, well, one of the technical aspects is who's doing the block production. That's okay, we can figure this out. There's proof of work, there's other consensus schemes. There's kind of a way of decentralizing block production. But then there's something else, that's funding. How do we fund the initial work? How do we fund ongoing work? How do we fund the servers for block production even? Block production, that's in this case, mining pays for the infrastructure, right? But how do we pay for marketing? Do we raise money? Are we going to go with the SEC? That's a question you need to answer if you want to build a decentralized system. Then there's also, is there even a token, a core token? What's its supply? Are we going to do a pre-mine, ninja mine, pre-sale, mining, earning, whatever? This all kind of affects how much decentralized you are, because if you have a governance token with voting and there's just one entity having it all, that can elect the block producers, that's surely not a decentralized system, right? Technically, all of these questions are part of governance. Why is that? Because governance tells you how processes work on the blockchain. And there's other questions that you need to answer for governance. One is, for instance, what's the fees if you want to do something? In Bitcoin, there's a market for fees, but it doesn't need to be a market. It could be a fixed fee, but who's deciding the fee, right? And then, of course, governance comes with a couple of requirements, like there needs to be some sort of talking to people, voting for proposals, these kind of things. So, routes to decentralized governance. Essentially, the question is, how do we get to a decentralized system? An approach that we very often see is there's one common enterprise in charge. You name it, a foundation. Yeah? And that foundation takes care of everything. It does marketing, public relations, infrastructure development, vision. It does all the things. It has the funding in most cases even. Or it does not have the funding. So how do you receive funding to build that blockchain? This is a really difficult thing because eventually you go into problems like there's this elite group of people that deal with developing. They are the elite people. They deal with everything. There's high expectations for the company that they deliver something. We see that a lot in the recent times. People that raised tons of money and they have to deliver. There's high expectations. Another, well, on the other edge, this was a centralized approach. The other edge would be a guerrilla style decentralized thing. Like there's no one in charge. There's no common enterprise. There's no foundation. There's no leadership even. No one in charge. That would be maybe the ideal thing for a decentralized system, but it's a trap. Why is it a trap? If anyone could do everything, no one's doing anything. Because why would they? Unless you pay anyone, no one would do anything to work on a system that benefits everyone else. It's a group trap, essentially. Well, essentially, you get also local clusters of people, like Westerns against Easterns, all these kind of psychology effects that are very difficult to govern. That leads me to option C, and that's a governed guerrilla team. Essentially, you build clusters, you build teams that can influence parts of your entire system, and they take care of development, marketing, individual teams, and there needs to be some way of governing that. So there needs to be voting on the blockchain, there needs to be some sort of approval process, then there also needs to be a way of distributing funds in a decentralized manner. And that's not really easy to do, really. Like, who's deciding over the funds. I don't agree with you. You want to spend funds over there. I do want to spend funds over there. That's why, companies have a board. They decide. They have to decide, and the shareholders cannot do anything other than re-elect board members. Well, and then there's potentially a way for starting centralized and going into decentralized systems. Potentially. We don't know how to do that yet. No one tried even. So the idea would be to maybe start in a centralized manner, especially when it comes to governance, like dealing with the usual company problems. Like if you you can think of this like a startup. You found a startup and you grow it, and then you make an IPO, and then it's a public company, right? You can do the same on the blockchain. You start with a small group, the founders, they deal with everything. It's clear from the beginning, those are the dictators, a group of people that tell you what this blockchain does. And then you need to find some way of going from this small group towards a bigger group. For instance, by investors that just buy themselves in, or rewarding people with a governance token for doing something. There's many ways of growing the group of people that govern something and shrinking the impact of the founders, right? We see that in regular companies from startup towards IPO. And then they are public. So the last point is actually the more interesting thing. I'm not sure who listened to my talk yesterday, but it was essentially about distributed autonomous companies, which try to essentially do that way. So you start with a company with an idea of profits, revenues, expenses, services, and these kind of things. And then, if you're successful, the blockchain can be considered a company and fund for its own development through profits earned from the services it provides. Easy example. If we were to change Bitcoin so that the transaction fees go to all those people that hold Bitcoin, like dividends, it would be a drama for SEC because it becomes a security token, but let that aside, it would really be an investment into a company, Bitcoin company, right? You get dividends as a shareholder. Of course, Bitcoin is not a company, it's a commodity, so that comparison is kind of weird, but the borders between a company and a commodity kind of blur with the existence of blockchain. Okay, I think that's enough. Thanks for the interest. I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much, Fabian. The question of decentralization is something that occupies our minds for the last 10 years at least. Remember, we're at decentralized, so yeah, it's going to be here forever. Questions for Fabian? Yes, please, right there in the back.
Thank you. I'd like to hear more about how the blockchain blurs the boundaries between commodities and securities that you've the last point you made.
Yeah. So I'm not a lawyer. I don't really know all of the securities law, but the boundaries that I draw is between having a commodity and having a company. There's even a third one, but between a commodity and a company, the only difference is what you do with the token, right? In a commodity, there's like, let's think Bitcoin is a commodity. Let's not go into detail whether it's a currency or a commodity. Let's call it a commodity for now. There's a we don't call it dilution, it's inflation. There's new tokens coming into the space and they go to some entity, like the miners. And then there's services that blockchain provides, namely you can transfer them from A to B quickly across the globe, and you pay a fee. Yeah? The fee goes to the miners, so they just get to mine your stuff. It's an incentive for them to actually include your transaction. It's a commodity because if you think about Bitcoin as a company, if I own Bitcoin and it's a company, I would expect some profits from it. And I'm not talking about capital appreciation because people speculate on it. That's not profits. Profits would be dividends that the blockchain pays out to me. That's what investors and startups expect to happen when they invest in a company. Dividends, or maybe later a higher exit because someone else goes in. But the dividends are interesting, and this is an aspect for companies. And on the other hand, you have a blockchain that can offer services, and the blockchain can ask for a fee for the services. The fees go into the working capital of the company, the blockchain, that just keeps it in a pool that no single entity has access to, but maybe a board of governance has access to that pool, or maybe all the core native token holders have access to that pool. That might become a little more like a company. But if you go one step further, you can say, okay, there's this pool, and once every quarter we just take half of the pool and pay it out as dividends to the people that hold the token. And it literally is just a difference in what your blockchain does with the token, right? Could be the difference could be as simple as a smart contract. On Ethereum, you can have both of them in parallel. Then you have a token that's a commodity, and you have a token that behaves more like a company that comes with services and the entire shebang with governance and stuff. Does that answer your question? Great.
Any other question? Yes, please.
Hi, thanks. You mentioned something about decentralizing liability. Can you give us some context? I know that we don't have much time, but we can actually elaborate on that later. But what do you mean?
Well, actually, I don't know what to do with decentralizing liability. I just know that people don't talk about it, and I know that there's companies that start blockchains, and they are liable. Still, people call these blockchains decentralized. But if someone sues that company and they have to close shops, no one's going to continue developing that blockchain. So it's a single point of failure. And if you remember, the single point of failure was one of the critical parts of being decentralized. So what I'm just trying to make people aware of, the problem that you get with responsibilities and liabilities when you do a blockchain, and that there needs to be a way for becoming decentralized, even though there might initially be liabilities. Satoshi isn't anonymous for no reason, right?
So you were not mentioning something like decentralize and distribute the liability in the sense of insurances or something?
No. Liabilities is something that happens in the real world. For instance, if you run a decentralized autonomous company, you should never call it a company. Why? Because the term company comes with legal implications. Namely, it comes with a headquarter, it comes with a CEO, and the CEO is liable for whatever the company does. But if you have a blockchain and people that govern the blockchain, and the CEO cannot influence what the people do there, how can he be liable for whatever happens on the blockchain?
Okay, I understand. Yeah, I thought something else. Okay, thanks very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Fabian. Great having you.
Thank you.